Hi, it's Dennis Daly. National causes have always used celebrities to draw attention to them. I got a press release once from a group that wants to help save the coral reefs. If you come to a certain restaurant, it said, you'll get to talk to, Peter Fonda, Ed Begley Jr., and Charlton Heston. Boy, I wasn't going to pass that up. The first person I ran into there was Ed Begley Jr., and I asked him about celebrity endorsements, whether or not you really knew what you were talking about.
I think the role is to be very responsible and to get good science behind you when you speak out on these matters. And that's what we have here. We have Henry Kendall, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, a diver like I, who's been down and seen the damage to the coral reefs and knows from looking at good science on the matter himself what's happening with our coral reefs. We have threatened the coral reefs throughout the world. It's possible we will lose 70% of the coral reefs in our lifetime if we don't act. So we have to do something. These are precious ecosystems, and they're part of the web of life that supports us all. If you had a problem with your pancreas and it was going to be threatened to the tune of 70%, if it was sick in that way, you would do something. Your gallbladder. This is what the coral reef system is on our planet. It's part of the system that keeps us all alive, keeps many species alive. A quarter of the marine species are found in coral reefs. That's a huge number. It's one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems that we have, so we must protect it.
I know I started visiting the Keys about 15 years ago, and I remember talking to an older fisherman who said, why can't the rest of the world understand the fragility of all of this that they live with down there? And you have all of that traffic going in and out of the Keys. I remember there was one sign that said no Valdez in the Keys down there.
And a good sign and a good idea. We must begin to tread lightly, and that's going to be the key. Henry David Thoreau said, a man is rich in proportion to the things he can afford to leave alone. And there are people who would trifle with the biodiversity and trifle with different species and say, I don't care about spotted owls, I don't care about this particular fish. Well, how many of those species can you lose? I mean, how many rivets can you lose from an airplane before it ceases to fly? That's the question. This is part of a web of life that supports us all, day in, day out.
Is that the tough thing, trying to get someone who's not even on the coast, who lives in Keokuk, Iowa, for example, to relate to this?
Well, that's the challenge. As much as we who live in the coast must respect, the role that the prairie grass plays in our lives and the weather patterns that are attached to the many ecosystems in the Midwest and, the rivers that flow through the Midwest that we all rely on. It's a global community. We have to see that and see that, environmental destruction knows no boundaries. It knows no nationality. And we have to work together. It certainly doesn't know any state boundaries. We have to pitch in together and solve these problems.
Ed Begley Jr. has a genuine interest in saving the coral reefs. Also, so does Peter Fonda, his father, the late Henry Fonda. Peter Fonda was quick to remind me that he is just not there as a talking head, as a star, as someone to lend credibility to the project. He is indeed a man of the sea.
And let me state that perhaps more than anybody you'll see tonight here, or maybe for the rest of the year, I have a more intimate relationship with the reefs of the tropics of the south of the Pacific Ocean and major reefs in the other areas of the oceans of the world than anybody else. I lived on my own ship for 14 years. I dove on the reefs. I lived with the reefs. I ate the fish that were hanging around the reefs. On some of the atolls, I'd fly fish in the water, standing on the reefs, very intimately involved with their ecosystem.
What is that like? I mean, my only association is occasionally in the Florida Keys, going to Key West, walking out, going in a boat. I'd never scuba dive. It must be a wonderful
scuba dive.
Well, I know there you can look down and just see it.
All around the island of Moorea or Bora Bora, a snorkel works just fine. And the reefs off the Quintana Roo, which is a state in Yucatan, the southeastern coast of Yucatan, they're all, you can just scuba over them and see everything you need to see. I do a lot of free diving too, but...
Peter, what is the danger? What is the enemy to the survival of those reefs?
Us.
The encroachment of people, the trash, the chemicals, all of that?
All of the above. The encroachment of people, the trash, the chemicals. Can you imagine what's going to happen to the reefs that are in the Gulf of Mexico after all the flooding that's happened in Hawaii, and then Ohio, that's going on right now in North Dakota?
It's got to go someplace.
It's going someplace. It goes down the muddy Missouri Missouri into the Mississippi, and it ends up in the Gulf, and it affects every living organism. Reefs, they are living organisms.
Is it true you can go extremely far out into the ocean and find styrofoam, cups, coolers, trash out there?
Having spent 14 years doing long-distance sailing just because I wanted to, not taking anything anyplace, not hauling freight, just hauling myself, because I wanted to sail to this island or wherever it was, I would run into that stuff. And of course it was spoken about from Tora Hydrothal about his bumping into big globs of oil. Because in the South Atlantic, what the oil tankers do is when they go through the South Atlantic, they put detergents in their big wells, and they set themselves up in the swells, so they rock back and forth, and then they dump it all over the side. Hi.
God-provided washing machine.
No, not you and me precisely, but us, because we need the oil, because we're going to drive our cars, and so forth. Somebody asked me earlier, well, how would you stop this? How would you stop the destruction of the reefs? And I say, stop flushing your toilets, industrial and personal, right away. We'll take the second step after we get that one together. That's going to be very hard to do.
Now we're going to talk to a man who is most famous possibly for parting the waters. Charlton Heston has been a rock, a stable influence here in Hollywood for decades. He was at the party in which those spots about the reef were premiered, and I put the question to him. What is it like to be a spokesperson, to lend your name to a good cause, but more than that, to be famous enough, to have the credibility enough to do it?
Well, that's one of the upsides of what otherwise has many drawbacks, to be a public person. And mind you, the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. But one of the advantages is to be able to get a forum. I mean, here you are. And what I say presumably will be conveyed to other people. And my concern for the coral reefs since Fraser was 13 and the youngest licensed diver in Los Angeles County. There was a period where we did a lot of diving, and we were on the Great Barrier Reef, which is the greatest reef in the world, 1,000 miles long, 50 miles off Australia. And it was then absolutely unique. Unique is an overused word. The barrier reef was unique. If it has been damaged and diminished, that's too bad. I'm very sorry. And that's the reason I'm glad to have a chance to go on record.
Well, I'm impressed by the fact that you have a familiarity with that. You weren't just brought here to lend your face, that Peter Fonda has sailed, that Ed Begley has researched a lot of this. That's good. I mean, I think a lot of people quite often criticize Hollywood types for just lending their name to something and not knowing much about it.
They do. They do. But I try not to. And while I don't dive anymore, I remember diving. I remember the incredible special beauty of the surface of a reef, 30 feet down, 40 feet down. The fish, the wildlife, that's the shells, the coral. And I know Fraser is a much better diver than I ever was, feels the same way.
I hate to be the millionth person to ask you this question, but when they show the Ten Commandments, and maybe I'm just a nut for movies of that era, do you still get reaction from around the world? I mean, it in some ways it doesn't hold up, but in many other ways it really does still.
Well, I must put to rest a nasty rumor that has no basis in fact. When I parted the Red Sea, there was no reef at the bottom. Now my son Fraser has dived on that reef, and he on the Red Sea, and he says there are chariot tracks.
I see.
No reef.
I love it where the duck flies into the special effects on the left side. I always wait for that.
The Fraser about whom Charlton Heston speaks is his son Fraser Heston, who has been a part of Hollywood since his birth. As a matter of fact, if you watch the Ten Commandments, it is Fraser Heston as a very small baby who is the baby Moses brought out of the water by actress Nina Foch. I asked Fraser if people still kid him about that.
Every day.
What is that sensation your dad mentioned about the intimacy you have when you dive? So few of us have experienced that.
Well, it's very true. In diving, especially in a coral reef, which is usually in warm, clear water, surrounded by fish of all different varieties and descriptions, you are in a situation that is quite different from being on land in a rainforest, say, or up in the mountains or any other beautiful environment. You're from another world, but you're allowed for a brief time, privileged time, to be a part of that world, and it's extraordinary.
When you were diving, were you aware at the time of the fragility of the damage we people were doing to this, or is it a recent realization for you?
Well, I think it's been a growing, somewhat disturbing realization over the years that the beauty that I enjoyed when I was much younger, 30 years ago, may not be around in a few more years for my son to enjoy, or perhaps his son or daughter to enjoy. And not only in terms of beauty and the privilege of being able to enjoy, diving in a park-like situation, but the importance of the reef and the ocean itself as a barometer for the health of our planet cannot be overemphasized. That if the reefs are ailing, the oceans are ailing. If the oceans are ailing, we're in big trouble.
The person responsible for getting the likes of Peter Fonda, Ed Begley Jr., Charlton Heston, and his son Fraser together and putting together the wonderful public service announcements narrated by Gene Hackman that you'll be seeing is an energetic woman named Medea Byrne. She has managed to put together a coalition of scientists and divers and people just concerned about the future of the planet. I asked her what methods her coalition, her group, were using in order to get the message out there.
Well, I think we're telling that story primarily through the medium such as this video, where we show people the beauty of the reefs. We have photographs that show them what they could see if they were to go snorkeling, for example, or to go scuba diving, and to let them know that not only is that beautiful rainforest under the sea in peril, from an aesthetic standpoint, but also there's a potential for enormous medicinal discoveries that are going to be lost within the next 20 to 40 years unless these reefs are saved. And that would affect them directly.
I remember I was in high school before it first occurred to me that a coral reef is not just a bunch of hardened something that's there. It's very much alive.
Very much alive. They're corals, the sponges, the fish. I heard a statistic the other day that said that there are 250,000 species that we cannot even see because they're hidden inside the crevices of the corals and sponges.
We're talking to Medea Byrne. She is the woman who is spearheading the coalition. I asked her, what are the threats to the coral reef? What things are destroying all that wonderful beauty?
One of the primary things is development, of course, where you have the silt runoff that goes directly into the reef and kills it straight away from smothering the coral. There's the global warming impact, of course. There's a small impact from people who will collect treasures from coral reefs. For example, as you mentioned, in Key West, the freighter that ran aground and just knocked a hole in the reef.
Yeah. We look at runoff you were talking about. Is there much coral in the Gulf that's going to be affected by all of these terrible rains we're seeing in the Mississippi and Missouri River now, or is that a concern in the Gulf of Mexico?
Now, I was raised on the Gulf of Mexico in Venice, Florida, and we have never been blessed with beautiful reefs there, but there is an ecosystem there to be protected. There's quite a bit of micro marine life, nudibranchs and that kind of thing that will be affected by the runoff.
What kind of reaction do you get when the light bulb comes on top of people's heads and they suddenly realize that coral reefs are living things, particularly children, school-age children? What kind of feedback do you get on this?
Well, it's interesting that you should mention that. I have a 5-year-old son who went snorkeling for the first time in Hawaii last year, and he has now decided that that this is something worthy of saving, and he wants it for himself, for his friends, and also for for other children around the world and future children. And it's an enormous feeling of accomplishment and feeling of community, that we can all together do something, that we realize that's something worth saving.
What about the average person? I know you tell people if one of the ways we can stop it is as simple as not buying figurines or other items made from coral. One final thing, what about the coalition that you're in charge of, heading up? Who all all is in it, and how did you get these people together?
The Coral Reef Alliance. We are a group that is, it's a nascent organization. It's a real grassroots kind of organization that's being formed using divers and snorkelers' affinity with the sea. And that's who we're reaching out for initially.
Well, thanks a lot. Some great PSAs. I think they're going to open some eyes.
I think so, too. And thank you very much for talking with me.
Boy, what a night. Peter Fonda, Ed Begley Jr., Charlton Heston, and Little Moses himself, Fraser Heston, who's not so little anymore. I'm Dennis Daly.